Police dog discovers judge's hidden $800,000 cash stash. What happened next is unbelievable. Max's nose led them straight to the wall behind Judge Harrison's law books. The German Shepherd pawed frantically at the hidden panel, whining with an urgency that Officer Johnson had never witnessed in their 5-year partnership. When the secret safe finally opened, what they found inside would destroy their faith in the justice system forever. Stacks of $100 bills, detailed ledgers documenting years of bribes, audio recordings of a respected judge casually negotiating the price of a child's safety. $75,000 for a suspended sentence. Harrison's voice echoed from the hidden recordings. Children's cases cost more because of the sensitivity involved. This wasn't just judicial corruption. It was systematic evil that had allowed hundreds of child predators to escape justice while their victims suffered in silence. Wealthy families had literally purchased favorable verdicts, turning the courthouse into a marketplace where innocence was sold to the highest bidder. But justice was coming, led by the most unlikely hero imaginable, a loyal police dog whose instincts had detected what human investigators missed. This is the shocking true story of courage, corruption, and the incredible bond that saved countless lives. 7-year-old Mia sat cross-legged on her bedroom carpet, her small fingers carefully arranging the miniature tea set she'd received for her birthday. The porcelain cups clinked softly as she poured imaginary tea for her collection of stuffed animals, their button eyes watching her with silent devotion. Her favorite companion, a worn gray rabbit named Whiskers, occupied the place of honor at her tiny table. "More sugar, Mr. Bear?" she whispered, her voice carrying the innocent authority of childhood make-believe. The house felt peaceful in that golden hour before bedtime, when the world seemed safe and predictable. Her mother's humming drifted up from the kitchen below, a gentle melody that wrapped around Mia like a warm blanket. Then the world exploded. A thunderous crash erupted from downstairs, followed by the splintering sound of wood and the harsh bark of commanding voices. Mia's tiny teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of pink porcelain. Her mother's humming transformed into a terrified scream that pierced through the floorboards and straight into Mia's heart. "Police! Search warrant!" Heavy boots pounded up the stairs like thunder. Each footfall, making her shouting, grew louder, more urgent. She pressed her face against Whiskers' soft fur, trying to block out the chaos that had invaded her safe world. Through the gap between her bedskirt and the floor, she watched uniformed legs moving past her doorway. Her mother's voice, usually so strong and protective, now carried notes of panic and desperation. Words she didn't understand floated through the house. Warrant, evidence, arrest. Then she heard his voice, her stepfather's angry roar cutting through the official commands. The same voice that had whispered terrible threats in the darkness, now raised in indignant protest. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "Sir, you need to put your hands behind your back. Now." The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut was followed by an ominous silence that felt heavier than all the shouting. Mia's small heart hammered against her ribs as footsteps approached her room. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to disappear into the shadows beneath her bed. But it was too late. Strong hands gently lifted the bedskirt, and a kind face appeared, not her stepfather's, but a stranger in uniform. "Hey there, sweetheart," the officer said softly. "You're safe now. Can you come out for me?" As Mia slowly emerged from her hiding place, still clutching Whiskers, she caught a glimpse through her doorway of her stepfather in the hallway. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his face twisted with rage. But it was his eyes that would haunt her dreams, cold, calculating, promising that this wasn't over. Even in custody, even surrounded by officers, his gaze found hers and delivered a silent message of future retribution. The little girl who had been pouring imaginary tea just minutes ago was gone, forever, replaced by someone who now understood that monsters were real, and sometimes they lived in your own house. Officer Mike Johnson pulled up to the neat suburban house on Maple Street, his 20 years of experience immediately cataloging the scene unfolding before him. Squad cars lined the quiet residential street, their emergency lights painting the manicured lawns in alternating shades of red and blue. Neighbors had emerged from their homes like cautious prairie dogs, clustering in small groups on sidewalks and porches, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of speculation. The house itself stood in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding it. A two-story colonial with cheerful yellow siding and a white picket fence. Window boxes overflowed with late summer flowers, and a child's bicycle lay abandoned on the front lawn, its pink streamers fluttering in the evening breeze. It was the kind of house already processing the complex mixture of emotions and evidence that human senses couldn't detect. Max had been Johnson's partner for 5 years, and in that time, they'd developed an almost telepathic connection. Tonight, Max's posture conveyed the same protective instinct that Johnson felt burning in his own chest. "Easy, boy," Johnson murmured, clipping Max's lead as they approached the house. "We've got work to do." Inside, the evidence collection was already underway. Johnson's jaw tightened as he reviewed the preliminary reports. Torn clothing, disturbing photographs, medical documentation that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Each piece of evidence felt like a weight settling on his shoulders, the accumulation of a child's stolen innocence laid out in clinical detail. Detective Lisa Chang, the lead investigator, approached with a grim expression. "It's bad, Johnson. Really bad. The medical evidence alone is enough to put him away for decades." She gestured toward the evidence bags being cataloged. "This little girl went through hell." Max moved closer to the staircase, his training directing him toward the source of the trauma. Johnson watched his partner's body language, the slight tension in his shoulders, the protective stance he adopted when children were involved in their cases. Max had an almost supernatural ability to sense vulnerability, and Johnson had learned to trust that instinct completely. The stepfather was led past them in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence with the indignant rage of someone unaccustomed to consequences. Johnson studied the man's face. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. It was a sobering reminder that monsters rarely announce themselves. As they processed the scene, Johnson found himself in conversation with Mia's mother, a fragile woman whose world had clearly shattered along with her daughter's. Her hands shook as she signed paperwork, her voice barely audible as she answered questions. "I should have known," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How could I not have known?" Johnson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, predators are experts at hiding their true nature. This isn't your fault. What matters now is that your daughter is safe, and we're going to make sure justice is served." It was a promise he made with the full weight of his badge behind it, not knowing that the justice system itself would soon become their greatest enemy. 3 weeks later, Johnson sat at his desk, reviewing the court assignment notification that had just arrived. The familiar letterhead of the county courthouse felt routine until he read the crucial detail. The Honorable Judge Marcus Harrison presiding. He leaned back in his chair, something nagging at the edge of his consciousness. Judge Harrison. Johnson had heard the name before, though he couldn't immediately place where. He computer scrolling through Harrison's background information. On paper, everything looked impeccable. Harvard Law School, 23 years on the bench, numerous community service awards. His photograph showed a distinguished man in his late 50s with silver hair and an authoritative bearing. But as Johnson dug deeper into Harrison's recent case history, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his veteran instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive through 2 decades of police work, were sending up subtle warning flags. "Hey, Martinez," he called out to a colleague passing by his desk. "Have you ever worked any cases with Judge Harrison?" Detective Maria Martinez paused, and Johnson noticed the almost imperceptible hesitation before she answered. "Harrison? Yeah, a few times. Why?" "Just got assigned to him for the Maple Street case. The kid's in bad shape. Stepfather was abusing her. Solid evidence package." Martinez's expression grew carefully neutral. "I'm sure it'll work out fine," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. As she walked away, Johnson caught her exchanging a meaningful glance with Sergeant Peterson. It was the kind of look that spoke volumes without saying a word. Over the next few days, Johnson noticed similar reactions whenever Harrison's name came up. Nothing overt, just uncomfortable silences, averted eyes, conversations that suddenly shifted to other topics. His fellow officers were trying to tell him something without actually saying it. The first courthouse visit for case preparation should have been routine. Johnson and Max made their way through the familiar halls of justice, their footsteps echoing off marble floors worn smooth by decades of legal proceedings. But as they passed Judge Harrison's chambers, Max exhibited behavior that Johnson had never seen before. The normally disciplined German shepherd stopped abruptly, his nose working overtime as he tested the air around Harrison's door. A low whine escaped his throat, not the alert signal for drugs or explosives, but something else entirely. Max pawed at the base of the door, his agitation increasing rather than decreasing. "What is it, boy?" Johnson murmured, crouching down to Max's level. The dog's brown eyes held an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human, and right now, those eyes were trying to communicate something urgent. Johnson gently tugged on Max's lead, but the dog resisted, continuing to focus on Harrison's chambers with laser-like intensity. This wasn't normal behavior. Max had been trained to detect narcotics, explosives, and accelerants. He'd never shown interest in anything else. Until now. That evening, Johnson made a detailed entry in his patrol log, documenting Max's unusual behavior with the precision of someone who understood that small details could become crucial evidence. He wrote, "Become far more complicated than a straightforward child abuse prosecution." As he drove home that night, Johnson found himself thinking about the look in little Mia's eyes when they'd found her hiding under her bed. She'd already been through so much. She deserved justice. They all did. But justice, Johnson was beginning to suspect, might be harder to come by than anyone imagined. The stage was set for a battle that would test everything Johnson believed about the system he'd sworn to serve, with an unlikely four-legged detective leading the charge toward a truth that no one wanted to see. The courthouse buzzed with an electric tension that seemed to vibrate through its marble corridors and into the packed courtroom where justice was supposed to be served. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, creating a sea of faces united by a common purpose: to witness accountability for the unthinkable crimes committed against an innocent child. Local news crews had set up their cameras in the designated media section, their lenses trained on the proceedings like mechanical eyes of public scrutiny. Victim advocates sat in the front rows, their presence a silent testament to the countless children who had suffered similar fates. Many wore purple ribbons, the color of domestic violence awareness, pinned to their lapels like badges of solidarity. Behind them, concerned citizens who had followed the case through newspaper coverage and social media whispers filled the remaining seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger, hope, and determination to see justice prevail. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. All rise for the Honorable Judge Marcus Harrison. Judge Harrison entered with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His black robes flowed behind him like the wings of some predatory bird, and his silver hair caught the courtroom's fluorescent lighting with an almost ethereal gleam. But it was the details that Johnson noticed from his position in the gallery: the expensive Armani suit visible beneath the judicial robes, the Rolex Submariner that caught the light as Harrison adjusted his papers, the Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most officers made in a month. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Max lying alert at his feet. The German Shepherd's behavior had been increasingly erratic during their courthouse visits, but today his agitation seemed to reach new heights. Max's ears were pinned back, his breathing slightly elevated, and every few minutes he would emit a barely audible whine that drew concerned glances from court security. District Attorney Rebecca Chen rose to present the state's case with the confidence of someone armed with Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. The evidence you will hear today will shock and disturb you, but it is evidence that demands justice for a child who had her innocence stolen by the very person who should have protected her. The prosecution's case unfolded like a textbook example of methodical legal work. DNA evidence was presented with scientific precision, biological samples that created an unbreakable chain linking the defendant to his crimes. Medical experts testified about injuries consistent with prolonged abuse, their clinical descriptions made more powerful by their understated delivery. Child psychologists explained the behavioral patterns they had observed in Mia, patterns that painted a heartbreaking picture of trauma and fear. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating what should have been an impregnable fortress of proof. Johnson had worked enough cases to recognize when prosecutors had done their homework, and Chen's team had clearly left nothing to chance. Photographs, medical records, witness statements, expert testimonies. It was the kind of comprehensive case that usually resulted in swift convictions and lengthy sentences. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Richard Brennan, seemed to be going through the motions with all the enthusiasm of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. His objections lacked passion, his cross-examinations felt perfunctory, and his overall demeanor suggested someone who had already accepted defeat before the trial began. Johnson had seen defense attorneys fight harder for clients caught shoplifting candy bars. As the day progressed, Max's behavior became increasingly concerning. The normally disciplined K-9 officer kept turning his attention toward Judge Harrison's bench, his sensitive nose working overtime as if detecting something that human senses couldn't perceive. When Harrison leaned forward to review documents, Max's agitation visibly increased. When the judge spoke, the dog's ears would flatten against his head in what Johnson recognized as a stress response. "Easy, boy," Johnson whispered, gently stroking Max's head to calm him. But the dog's instincts were clearly trying to communicate something important, something that went beyond the normal stress of a courtroom environment. The gallery watched the proceedings with the fascination of people witnessing what they believed would be swift justice. Victim advocates took notes, preparing for what they assumed would be impact statements during sentencing. Citizens who had invested their emotional energy in following this case sat forward in their seats, waiting for the moment when evil would face consequences. None of them could have imagined the travesty that was about to unfold. What happened next would haunt everyone in that courtroom for years to come. Judge Harrison began his systematic dismantling of the prosecution's case with the casual efficiency of someone following a well-rehearsed script. "Objections sustained," Harrison announced, for the 7th time in 20 minutes, his gavel striking the bench with the finality of an executioner's axe. The DNA evidence, the scientific proof that should have sealed the defendant's fate, was ruled inadmissible due to what Harrison claimed were procedural irregularities in the chain of custody. The collective gasp from the gallery was audible, but Harrison's expression remained impassive, as if he were discussing the weather rather than destroying the foundation of justice for a traumatized child. District Attorney Chen stood in stunned disbelief. "Your Honor, the chain of custody documentation is complete and verified. This evidence was collected and processed according to standard protocols that have been accepted by this court hundreds of times before." "Nevertheless, Counselor," Harrison replied, with barely concealed condescension, "this court finds reasonable doubt regarding the integrity of the evidence collection process. The jury will disregard." Johnson felt his hands clench involuntarily as he watched 20 years of legal experience being turned on its head. Chain of custody procedures existed precisely to ensure evidence integrity, and the protocols followed in this case were textbook perfect. There was no legal basis for Harrison's ruling, no precedent, no reasonable interpretation of evidence law that could justify such a decision. The medical testimony faced similar treatment. Dr. Sarah Williams, a pediatric forensic specialist with 30 years of experience, began presenting her findings about injuries consistent with prolonged sexual abuse. Her credentials were impeccable, her methodology beyond reproach, her conclusions supported by extensive medical literature. "Objection," called defense attorney Brennan, though even he seemed surprised by his own interruption. "Sustained," Harrison ruled before the objection was even fully articulated. "The witness's testimony is speculative and prejudicial." Dr. Williams stared at the judge in bewilderment. "Your Honor, I'm presenting factual medical findings based on established forensic protocols. These aren't opinions. These are documented physical injuries with known causation patterns." "The court has ruled, Doctor. Please step down." In the gallery, Mia's mother began to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking as she watched each piece of evidence that might protect her daughter being systematically destroyed. Victim advocates placed comforting hands on her shoulders. "Officer Johnson," whispered the bailiff, "you need to control your canine." But Johnson was too stunned to respond immediately. His 20 years of experience told him that what he was witnessing wasn't just bad jurisprudence, it was something far more sinister. Legal rulings this consistently wrong, this systematically biased against the prosecution, didn't happen by accident. They happened by design. When the child psychologist's testimony was similarly gutted by Harrison's rulings, Johnson felt a cold realization settling in his stomach like a stone. The witness testimonies that corroborated Mia's account were deemed unreliable, despite their consistency and detail. Character witnesses who spoke to the defendant's history of inappropriate behavior were ruled irrelevant to the current charges. Each ruling felt like another nail in the coffin of justice. Each sustained objection, another betrayal of the principles that Johnson had spent his career defending. The prosecution's carefully constructed case was being dismantled, piece by piece, not by legal brilliance or procedural errors, but by what appeared to be judicial corruption on a scale that Johnson had never imagined possible. Max's whining had evolved into intermittent yelps of distress, his canine instincts detecting something that his human partner was only beginning to understand. The dog's acute senses were picking up on corruption so brazen, so systematic, that even a trained police animal could sense the wrongness of it. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Johnson made a mental note of every irregularity, every impossible ruling, every moment when justice had been perverted. His notebook filled with observations that would have seemed like conspiracy theories in any other context, but which were now playing out in real time before a courtroom full of witnesses. The final act of this judicial farce began with Judge Harrison's condescending lecture about the burden of proof, a legal concept he wielded like a weapon against the very child he was supposed to protect. The state has failed to meet its burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, Harrison intoned, his voice carrying the false gravity of someone performing for an invisible audience. While the allegations in this case are serious, we must remember that in our system of justice, the accused is innocent until proven guilty. Emotion cannot substitute for evidence, and speculation cannot replace proof. Johnson wanted to scream. The evidence had been overwhelming. DNA, medical testimony, expert analysis, corroborating witnesses. It hadn't been speculative or emotional. It had been scientific, methodical, and damning. The only thing that had failed was the system itself, embodied by the corrupt figure sitting behind the judge's bench. Therefore, Harrison continued, his words falling like stones into the silent courtroom, to 2 years imprisonment, suspended with 5 years probation. The collective gasp of horror that rose from the gallery seemed to physically impact the walls of the courtroom. Suspended sentence, probation, for crimes that should have resulted in decades behind bars. This monster was walking free, with nothing more than a legal slap on the wrist. In the defendant's section, Mia's stepfather, the man who had stolen her childhood and shattered her innocence, allowed himself a small, triumphant smirk. As he rose from his chair, his eyes swept the courtroom until they found Mia, small and traumatized in the front row beside her mother. That smirk widened into something predatory as he walked past them toward the courtroom exit, a free man who had just learned that his crimes carried no real consequences. Johnson's hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles turned white. 20 years of police work, 20 years of believing in the system, 20 years of telling victims' families that justice would prevail, all of it crumbling in the space of a single, impossible verdict. "This isn't over," he whispered hoarsely to Mia's mother as the courtroom began to empty. "I promise you, this isn't over." But even as he spoke those words, Johnson wondered what promise he could possibly keep. If the courts themselves were corrupted, if judges could be bought and justice could be perverted at the highest levels, what hope did any of them have? Max provided the answer in the most primitive, honest way possible. As the courtroom cleared and the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in, the German shepherd threw back his head and released a howl that echoed through the marble corridors of the courthouse. It was a sound of pure anguish, of instinctive recognition that justice had been murdered in this place that was supposed to be its sanctuary. The howl seemed to go on forever, a canine lament for innocence betrayed and trust shattered. It was the sound of a police dog who had detected the stench of corruption so profound that it overwhelmed every other scent in the building. And in that moment, Johnson realized that his partner had been trying to warn him all along. The battle for justice was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The return visits to the courthouse should have been routine administrative tasks, filing paperwork, submitting evidence reports, completing the mundane bureaucratic requirements that followed every case. But for Officer Johnson and his canine partner Max, these visits had become exercises that seemed to agitate him in ways Johnson had never witnessed before. To understand the significance of Max's behavior, one had to appreciate the extraordinary training that had shaped him into one of the most reliable canine officers in the state. Max had graduated at the top of his class from the National Canine Academy, where he'd undergone 18 months of intensive training in narcotics detection, explosive identification, suspect apprehension, and search and rescue operations. His olfactory system, already 40 times more sensitive than a human's, had been honed to detect minute traces of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, and various explosive compounds, at concentrations measured in parts per billion. During his 5-year partnership with Johnson, Max's record had been flawless. He had never produced a false positive alert, never missed a legitimate detection, and never failed to follow through on a command. His testimony had been accepted in over 200 court cases, and his reliability had become legendary among prosecutors who knew that Max's alerts were as good as signed confessions. Defense attorneys had learned not to challenge Max's findings because his accuracy rate was statistically perfect, which made his current behavior all the more troubling. Every time they passed Judge Harrison's chambers, Max would stop abruptly, his body going rigid with concentration. A low whine would escape his throat, not the sharp, focused alert that indicated drugs or explosives, but something else entirely, something that spoke of distress, confusion, and an urgent need to communicate something that transcended the boundaries between species. The specific behaviors were becoming more pronounced with each visit. Max would scratch at the base of Harrison's door with increasing desperation, his claws leaving subtle marks on the expensive wood paneling. When Johnson tried to lead him away, the normally obedient dog would resist, pulling back toward the chambers with a determination that bordered on obsession. Most concerning of all, Max had begun refusing direct commands when they were in proximity to Harrison's office, something that had never happened in their entire partnership. Johnson began documenting these incidents with the methodical precision of someone who understood that patterns could become evidence. His patrol log filled with detailed observations. 14:30 hours. Max exhibits agitation response at Harrison Chambers' door, whining, scratching, resistance to heel command. Duration approximately 4 minutes. Each entry was time-stamped, witnessed when possible, and described with the objective language that would hold up under legal scrutiny. The comparison to Max's normal detection behaviors made the anomaly even more striking. When Max detected narcotics, his alert was immediate and decisive. A sharp bark, a sit-and-stare position, and then patient, waiting for his handler's command. When he identified explosive materials, his response was even more pronounced, an aggressive alert, followed by an immediate retreat to a safe distance. These were behaviors ingrained through thousands of repetitions, backed by positive reinforcement and tested in countless real-world scenarios. But this new behavior pattern fit none of his established training protocols. Max wasn't alerting to drugs or explosives. Johnson was certain of that. This was something else. Something that existed outside the parameters of his formal training, but within the broader spectrum of his natural canine instincts. Johnson found himself studying his partner with new intensity, watching for subtle cues that might explain the mystery. Max's body language spoke of recognition rather than detection, as if he were encountering something familiar rather than discovering something hidden. His persistence suggested not just professional duty, but personal investment, as if whatever he was sensing posed a direct threat to something he was programmed to protect. The growing conviction that Max was onto something significant began to override Johnson's rational skepticism. 20 years of police work had taught him to trust evidence over intuition, but it had also taught him to recognize when patterns demanded investigation. Max's behavior wasn't random or stress-induced. It was consistent, focused, and intensifying over time. As Johnson sat in his patrol car after yet another disturbing courthouse visit, watching Max pace restlessly in the back seat, he faced a decision that would define the rest of his career. He could dismiss his partner's behavior as an inexplicable quirk, file his reports, and move on to the next case. Or he could trust the instincts of an animal whose judgment had never failed him before, even when those instincts were leading him toward a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable. Max was trying to tell him something, and Johnson owed it to their partnership, and to every victim who had been failed by the system, to listen. Johnson's decision to conduct unofficial experiments with Max's behavior represented a crossing of professional boundaries that could have ended his career. But the alternative, ignoring what might be crucial evidence of corruption, felt like a betrayal of everything his badge represented. The experiments began subtly, incorporated into legitimate courthouse visits to avoid suspicion. Johnson would vary their routes through the building, timing their presence during different hours, and observing Max's reactions to various locations and personnel. What emerged was a pattern so specific and consistent that it eliminated any possibility of coincidence. Max's agitation was triggered by exactly 2 locations: Judge Harrison's private chambers and Harrison's reserved parking space. To the evidence storage areas around the holding cells, areas that typically held residual scents from countless criminal cases, and Max would remain calm and professional. But the moment they approached Harrison's domain, the German Shepherd would transform into a creature driven by an urgent need to investigate something that his human partner couldn't perceive. The parking space experiment proved particularly revealing. Johnson had brought Max through the courthouse garage on a Saturday morning when the building was nearly empty. As they approached Harrison's designated space, clearly marked with a brass nameplate, Max exhibited the same intense, alert behavior he'd shown at the chambers. His nose worked frantically along the concrete where Harrison's luxury sedan typically parked, and his whining reached a pitch that suggested genuine distress. Confused and increasingly concerned, Johnson reached out to Sergeant Maria Santos, the department's head canine trainer and the woman who had originally paired him with Max 5 years earlier. Santos had trained police dogs for over 2 decades, and her expertise in canine behavior was recognized throughout the state law enforcement community. "Maria, I need to run something by you," Johnson said during a carefully casual phone conversation. Hypothetically, if a dog was consistently alerting to the same location but it wasn't drugs or explosives, what else might he be detecting? Santos was quiet for a moment, her professional mind processing the implications of the question. Hypothetically? Dogs can detect a lot of things we don't train them for. Currency, for instance. Paper money has a very distinctive scent profile. The cotton-linen blend, the metallic inks, the handling residue from thousands of hands. A sensitive dog might react to large concentrations of cash, especially if it's been stored in a confined space for extended periods. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Santos explaining the olfactory science behind currency detection. Large amounts of cash, particularly bills that had been bundled and stored together, would create a scent signature powerful enough to trigger responses in highly trained detection dogs. The phenomenon wasn't well documented because it fell outside normal police canine applications, but the theoretical framework was sound. Johnson thanked Santos and ended the call, his mind racing with the implications. If Max was detecting large quantities of cash in Harrison's chambers and parking area, it raised questions that went far beyond judicial ethics. Judges didn't typically handle significant amounts of currency in their official duties, and the amounts required to trigger Max's intense reactions would suggest something far more sinister than legitimate financial activity. His documentation became more detailed and systematic. Johnson began carrying a digital camera, discreetly photographing Max's behavior during their courthouse visits. He measured the duration of alert responses, noted environmental factors that might influence the dog's reactions, and created detailed maps showing exactly where Max's agitation was strongest within Harrison's chambers area. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Max's behavior suggested the presence of substantial quantities of cash in locations where such currency had no legitimate reason to exist. Combined with the irregularities Johnson had observed during the trial, a picture was emerging that demanded professional investigation. The decision to involve higher authorities represented a point of no return that Johnson approached with full awareness of the potential consequences. Accusing a sitting judge of corruption based primarily on a dog's behavior would make him a laughingstock if he was wrong, and a target if he was right. His pension, his reputation, and potentially his safety were all at stake. But as he watched Max's continued distress during their courthouse visits, Johnson realized that some risks were worth taking. The integrity of the justice system itself was at stake, and if his partner was right about what he was detecting, then children like Mia were being betrayed by the very institutions meant to protect them. The time for unofficial experiments and private speculation was ending. It was time to make the call that would either vindicate his suspicions or destroy his career. That evening, Johnson sat in his study at home, staring at the phone number for internal affairs that he'd written on a slip of paper hours earlier. Max lay at his feet, the German shepherd's brown eyes holding that peculiar intelligence that had made their partnership so successful over the years. In the quiet of his home, away from the pressures and politics of the department, Johnson found himself engaged in the kind of internal dialogue that defined career-altering moments. 20 years of police work had taught him that instincts could be wrong, that hunches could lead good cops down rabbit holes that destroyed careers and discredited legitimate investigations. But those same 20 years had also taught him to recognize when patterns demanded attention, when anomalies pointed toward truths that no one wanted to acknowledge. His mind drifted back to the Riverside Elementary case 3 years earlier, when Max had alerted to a maintenance closet that had already been searched twice by human officers. Johnson had trusted his partner's instincts and insisted on a third search, despite the irritation of his colleagues and the skepticism of the school administration. Max had been right. Hidden behind a false wall, they'd discovered over 50 pounds of methamphetamine that had been missed by conventional search techniques. The arrest had broken up a distribution network that had been poisoning the community for months. Then there was the warehouse fire investigation, when Max had refused to enter a building that had been cleared by the fire department and declared structurally sound. Johnson had pulled the entire team back 30 minutes before a secondary collapse that would have killed them all. The fire chief later admitted that Max's instincts had detected structural instabilities that human analysis had missed. Case after case, Max's judgment had proven superior to human reasoning. The dog's sensory capabilities, combined with an intuitive understanding of threat assessment that transcended formal training, had repeatedly led them toward truths that conventional investigation methods had overlooked. The bond between a police officer and his canine partner went beyond professional collaboration. It was a relationship built on absolute trust, mutual dependence, and shared purpose. Johnson had learned to read Max's body language like a second language, to interpret subtle changes in posture and behavior that communicated volumes. In return, Max had learned to trust Johnson's judgment, to follow commands, even when his instincts suggested different courses of action. But this situation was different. Max wasn't just alerting to potential evidence. He was displaying a level of persistent agitation that suggested personal investment in the outcome. It was as if the German Shepherd understood that something fundamentally wrong was occurring in the courthouse, something that threatened the very principles of justice that their partnership was meant to serve. Johnson looked down at his partner, who was watching him with that uncanny canine ability to sense human emotional states. "What do you think, boy? Are we doing the right thing?" Max's tail thumped once against the floor. Not the enthusiastic wagging of playtime, but the serious acknowledgement of a working dog who understood that important decisions were being made. The phone felt heavy in Johnson's hand as he dialed the internal affairs number. Each ring seemed to echo with the weight of consequences that would follow this conversation. There would be no going back once he made these allegations, no way to unring this particular bell. Detective Sarah Martinez answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the professional wariness of someone accustomed to dealing with department politics and career-ending accusations. Internal Affairs, Detective Martinez speaking. Detective Martinez, this is Officer Mike Johnson. Badge number 2847. I need to report suspected judicial corruption involving Judge Marcus Harrison. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. When Martinez spoke again, her tone had shifted from routine professionalism to sharp attention. "Officer Johnson, that's a very serious allegation. What's the nature of your evidence?" Johnson took a deep breath, knowing that the next words would define the rest of his career. "My K9 partner has been consistently alerting to the presence of what we believe to be large quantities of currency in Judge Harrison's chambers and personal parking space. Combined with irregularities I observed during a recent trial, I believe we're looking at systematic corruption that demands immediate investigation." As he spoke those words, Max rose from his position on the floor and moved to sit directly beside Johnson's chair, his presence a silent reminder that some partnerships transcended the boundaries between species. Whatever came next, They would face it together. The investigation that would ultimately expose one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in state history had officially begun. Initiated by the instincts of a police dog and the courage of an officer willing to trust his partner's judgment over his own career security. The underground parking garage of the Riverside shopping mall felt like an appropriately clandestine location for a conversation that could either expose massive corruption or destroy two careers in spectacular fashion. Detective Sarah Martinez had chosen the meeting spot carefully, far from the courthouse, the police station, and any location where their conversation might be overheard by the wrong ears. At 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night, the garage was virtually empty, their voices echoing off concrete walls that had witnessed countless secret meetings over the years. Johnson arrived first. Max, sitting alertly in the passenger seat of his unmarked cruiser. The German shepherd seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. His ears pricked forward as his sensitive hearing catalogued every sound in the cavernous space. When Martinez's black sedan pulled up alongside them, Max's posture shifted to full attention. Not aggressive, but watchful, in the way that had made him such an effective police partner. Martinez emerged from her soul with the measured movements of someone who had spent 15 years navigating the treacherous waters of internal police politics. Her reputation within the department was solid, but complicated. She was known for her thoroughness, her integrity, and her willingness to pursue investigations that other detectives found too politically sensitive to touch. She was also known for her skepticism, her demand for concrete evidence, and her intolerance for conspiracy theories that wasted departmental resources. "Officer Johnson," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "This better be good. Accusing a sitting judge of corruption isn't something we do lightly around here." Johnson shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the direct assessment in her eyes. "Detective Martinez, I appreciate you meeting me like this. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out." They moved to a concrete pillar that provided both privacy and a clear view of anyone approaching their location. Johnson opened a manila folder filled with his meticulously documented observations, courthouse visits with unusual reactions. "For the past 6 weeks, my canine partner has been exhibiting consistent alert behavior at Judge Harrison's chambers and personal parking space," Johnson began, his voice carrying the professional tone he'd learned to use when presenting evidence. "Max has never produced a false positive in 5 years of service. His accuracy rate is perfect, but he's not alerting to drugs or explosives. This is something else entirely." Martinez's expression remained neutral as she reviewed the documentation, though Johnson noticed her eyebrows raised slightly at the precision of his record-keeping. "Officer Johnson, with all due respect, dogs can have behavioral issues, stress, environmental factors, health problems. There are dozens of explanations for unusual canine behavior that don't involve judicial corruption." "That's what I thought initially," Johnson replied, pulling out a second folder. "But then I started looking at Harrison's recent rulings in child abuse cases. Detective, the pattern is unmistakable." The second folder contained copies of court transcripts, judicial rulings, and case outcomes from Harrison's courtroom over the past 18 months. Johnson had spent countless off-duty hours compiling the information, cross-referencing dates, outcomes, and procedural irregularities that painted a disturbing picture of systematic bias. "Look at the Maple Street case, my case," Johnson continued, his voice tightening with controlled anger. "Overwhelming evidence, perfect chain of custody, expert testimony from nationally recognized specialists. Harrison threw it all out on technicalities that don't exist in any legal textbook I've ever read. The defendant walked free, with a suspended sentence for crimes that should have resulted in decades in prison. Martinez studied the documents with increasing intensity, her skepticism beginning to give way to professional concern. The Morrison case, the Westfield incident, the Oakwood abuse prosecution, Jesus Johnson, these are all child abuse cases with similar outcomes. Defendants with rock-solid evidence against them, receiving inexplicably lenient sentences. 7 cases in 18 months, Johnson said grimly. 7 children denied justice. 7 predators walking free, all because of rulings that make no legal sense unless you assume corruption at the judicial level. The pattern was undeniable once it was laid out systematically. Child abuse cases that should have resulted in swift convictions were being systematically undermined by a judge whose rulings defied legal logic and precedent. Evidence was being excluded on non-existent technicalities. Witness testimony was being discredited through procedural manipulations, and sentences were being reduced to meaningless, symbolic gestures. Martinez closed the folders and leaned back against the concrete pillar, her mind processing the implications of what Johnson had presented. This officer. If you're right, we're looking at corruption that goes to the heart of the justice system. But if you're wrong, we're both looking at career suicide. My dog doesn't lie, Detective, Johnson said simply. Max is detecting something in Harrison's chambers that doesn't belong there. Combined with these case irregularities, I think we both know what that something is. The silence stretched between them as Martinez weighed the evidence against the risks. Internal affairs investigations of sitting judges were politically treacherous under the best circumstances. Investigations based partially on canine behavior were unprecedented and potentially career-ending if they proved unfounded. Preliminary surveillance only, Martinez finally said, her voice carrying the authority of someone making a decision that would define her legacy. We establish patterns, document behaviors, and see if your dog's instincts match up with more conventional evidence. But Officer Johnson, this stays between us until we have something concrete. One word of this leaks to the wrong person, and we're both looking for new careers. Johnson nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they were undertaking. Absolute secrecy. I understand. As they prepared to leave the parking garage, Martinez turned back to him with a final warning. Officer Johnson, I hope to God you're right about this, because if Judge Harrison is innocent, what we're about to do will destroy us both. The financial investigation into Judge Marcus Harrison's lifestyle began with the kind of meticulous background work that formed the foundation of all successful corruption cases. Detective Martinez had assembled a small team of trusted investigators, each sworn to absolute secrecy and fully briefed on the career-ending implications of their work. They operated out of a rented office space 3 miles from police headquarters, using equipment and resources that wouldn't appear on any departmental budget reports. Harrison's financial profile, when examined closely, revealed discrepancies that would have been impossible to ignore if anyone had been looking. His official judicial salary of $165,000 per year should have supported a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, but the evidence suggested something far more extravagant. Property records showed that he had recently completed a $400,000 renovation of his suburban mansion, including a new 3-car garage, a swimming pool with an attached spa, and a wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries. The vehicle registration database revealed even more troubling details. Harrison had purchased a new BMW 7 Series sedan 18 months earlier, paying the $95,000 sticker price in cash, according to dealership records. 6 months later, he had added a Mercedes-Benz S-Class coupe to his collection, also purchased outright without financing. The combined value of his vehicle collection exceeded $200,000. More than his entire annual salary before taxes. Credit card analysis painted a picture of luxury travel that defied explanation on a judge's income. First-class flights to European destinations, extended stays at five-star resorts, dining at restaurants where single meals cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. The pattern was consistent and accelerating. Harrison's lifestyle had undergone a dramatic upgrade that coincided almost exactly with the beginning of his suspicious rulings in child abuse cases. Detective Lisa Park, Martinez's most trusted financial investigator, had spent 3 days analyzing Harrison's banking records through carefully obtained warrants. "Sarah, the numbers don't add up," she reported during a late-night team meeting. "His official income streams are fully documented. Judicial salary, some investment dividends, a small rental property. But his expenditures suggest an income at least 3 times higher than what he's reporting." The offshore account discoveries proved even more damning. Through banking surveillance and financial intelligence networks, the team had identified at least 4 accounts in Caribbean banks that appeared to be linked to Harrison through a complex web of shell corporations and trust arrangements. The account activity showed regular large deposits that corresponded suspiciously with the timeline of controversial court rulings. Martinez spread the financial analysis across a conference table, creating a visual timeline that connected Harrison's increased wealth with his judicial decisions. "Look at this pattern. The Morrison case verdict was handed down on March 15th. 3 days later, a $75,000 deposit shows up in the Cayman Islands account. The Westfield ruling came down on June 2nd, followed by another $60,000 deposit within the week. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. 7 major child abuse cases with inexplicably lenient sentences, followed by 7 significant financial deposits totaling over $450,000 in untraceable offshore accounts. The mathematical probability of such coincidences occurring naturally was essentially 0. Cross-referencing with defendants who had received lenient sentences revealed another disturbing pattern. Many of the abusers came from wealthy families or had connections to individuals with significant financial resources. Defense attorneys in these cases often represented clients who could afford to pay substantial fees, and those same attorneys appeared repeatedly in Harrison's courtroom for cases involving wealthy defendants accused of serious crimes. The team's financial forensics expert, Detective Michael Chang, had worked white-collar crime for over a decade before joining Internal Affairs. His analysis of the money trail revealed the sophisticated planning behind Harrison's corruptions, coordinating payments, managing offshore accounts, and ensuring that the money flow remains untraceable through conventional channels. Martinez felt the weight of the investigation settling on her shoulders as the evidence accumulated. They were no longer looking at simple judicial misconduct. This was organized crime operating within the justice system itself. The scope of the corruption suggested a network of individuals working together to pervert the course of justice for financial gain, with children's safety being literally sold to the highest bidder. The specialized surveillance team that Martinez was assembling represented the best that law enforcement had to offer. Electronics specialists who could install untraceable monitoring equipment, financial investigators who could track money flows through the most sophisticated laundering schemes, and behavioral analysts who could interpret the subtle signs of corruption in action. Each team member understood that they were risking their careers to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the justice system. As the preliminary investigation phase drew to a close, Martinez reviewed the accumulated evidence with the satisfaction of someone who had built an unshakable foundation for what was to come. Harrison's financial profile was impossible to explain through legitimate means. His judicial rulings followed patterns that suggested systematic corruption, and the correlation between his decisions and his bank deposits was too precise to be coincidental. The time for financial analysis and background investigation was ending. Now came the most dangerous phase of their operation: active surveillance of a sitting judge who had already demonstrated his willingness to pervert justice for money. The covert surveillance operation targeting Judge Marcus Harrison represented the culmination of weeks of careful planning and the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the investigation. Martinez had assembled her team in the rented office space that had become their unofficial headquarters, the walls now covered with photographs, financial charts, and surveillance equipment diagrams that told the story of systematic judicial corruption. The technology setup required for monitoring a sitting judge without detection pushed the boundaries of what internal affairs typically attempted. Electronic surveillance specialists had spent 3 days installing microscopic cameras in the courthouse corridors near Harrison's chambers, devices so small they were virtually invisible to casual observation, but capable of recording high-definition video with audio pickup sensitive enough to capture conversations through closed doors. Harrison's private parking space in the courthouse garage had been equipped with motion-activated cameras, hidden within the existing security infrastructure. Monitoring software had been installed to track any unusual banking activity in real time, alerting the team to large deposits or withdrawals that might indicate active bribery. The team briefing felt like a military operation, with Martinez emphasizing the extraordinary sensitivity of their mission and the career-ending implications for everyone involved. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to conduct surveillance on a sitting judge of the Superior Court," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "If we're discovered, if we make mistakes, if this operation is compromised in any way, our careers are over and the entire investigation becomes worthless." Detective Park raised her hand. "What's our legal standing if we capture evidence of active corruption? Are we operating under existing warrants, or are we in legal gray areas?" "Everything we're doing has been cleared through the Attorney General's office," Martinez replied, though her tone suggested the clearances had been obtained through channels that preferred not to be documented. "We have authorization for electronic surveillance, financial monitoring, and photographic documentation. But that authorization comes with the understanding that any evidence we gather must be unimpeachable in court." The security protocols were exhaustive, designed to prevent detection by courthouse staff who might be sympathetic to Harrison or simply curious about unusual activity. Team members would enter and exit the building through different entrances, their presence staggered to avoid drawing attention. Communication would be conducted through encrypted channels only, with no references to the operation in official departmental records until they had evidence sufficient to justify formal charges. Johnson and Max's role in the surveillance operation was unique and potentially crucial. Max's ability to detect large concentrations of currency made him an early warning system for bribery attempts, his sensitive nose capable of identifying the presence of substantial cash payments before human surveillance could document the actual transactions. If Harrison was receiving regular bribes, Max would know about it before anyone else. "Officer Johnson," Martinez addressed him directly, "your K-9 partner may be our best asset in this operation. If Max alerts to unusual activity, we need to know immediately. His instincts could give us the advance warning we need to position surveillance assets for maximum effectiveness. The first night of surveillance began with the tension and anticipation that characterized all high-stakes law enforcement operations. Martinez positioned herself in a courthouse office across the hall from Harrison's chambers, using electronic equipment that could monitor his movements and conversations without requiring direct visual contact. Park and Chang took positions in the parking garage, their surveillance van disguised as a maintenance vehicle conducting routine electrical repairs. Johnson and Max patrolled the courthouse corridors on a schedule designed to appear routine, while providing regular opportunities for the German Shepherd to test the air around Harrison's domain. Their presence was officially justified by standard security sweeps, but their real purpose was to serve as an early warning system for corruption in progress. The electronic equipment hummed quietly in the darkness, digital recordings beginning that would either expose one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in state history or end the careers of everyone involved in the investigation. Hidden cameras captured empty corridors, audio pickups monitored silent offices, and financial tracking software scanned banking networks for unusual activity. As the clock approached midnight and the courthouse settled into its nighttime quiet, Martinez felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that accompanied major investigations. They were crossing a line that would define all their careers, pursuing evidence that could restore faith in the justice system or destroy it entirely. In the corridor outside Harrison's chambers, Max's ears pricked forward as his sensitive nose detected something that his human partners couldn't perceive. The investigation that would ultimately expose systematic corruption at the highest levels of the judicial system was officially underway, guided by the instincts of a police dog and the courage of officers willing to risk everything for justice. The hunt for truth had begun, and there would be no turning back until they had either proven their case or destroyed themselves in the attempt. The breakthrough came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, when the courthouse should have been empty, except for security guards making their routine rounds. Detective Martinez was monitoring the surveillance feeds from her position in the rented office space, fighting off fatigue from another 16-hour day of watching and waiting, when movement on camera 7 made her instantly alert. A shadowy figure had emerged from the courthouse's rarely used service entrance, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and how to avoid detection. The person wore a dark overcoat and a baseball cap pulled low, their face deliberately obscured from the security cameras that monitored the main corridors. But the hidden surveillance equipment that Martinez's team had installed captured everything with crystal clarity. The figure moved through the courthouse with practiced ease, avoiding the main elevators and using a back staircase that led directly to the judicial wing. Their path was so precise, so deliberate, that it spoke of previous visits and intimate knowledge of the building's layout. This wasn't someone stumbling around in the dark. This was someone following a well-established routine. Martinez grabbed her radio. "All units, we have movement in the target area. Repeat." Harrison's chambers. Judge Harrison was waiting for them. The hidden cameras captured him opening his chamber's door before his visitor even knocked, confirming that this meeting had been prearranged. Harrison appeared relaxed, almost casual, wearing an expensive silk robe over his pajamas, attire that suggested this late-night business was conducted from the comfort of his own home-like environment within the courthouse. Right on time, Harrison's voice came through clearly on the audio pickup. "Do you have it?" The visitor, a middle-aged man whose face was finally visible in the chamber's lighting, nodded and set a leather briefcase on Harrison's mahogany desk. Everything we discussed. Unmarked bills, non-sequential serial numbers, exactly as requested. What happened next would have been impossible to believe without the video evidence to document it. Harrison opened the briefcase with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. Inside, neat stacks of $100 bills were arranged in precise rows, the currency bound with rubber bands and organized by denomination. Harrison began counting with methodical precision, his fingers moving through the cash with the practiced ease of a bank teller. 50, 60, 75,000, he murmured as he worked. The usual amount for this level of case complexity. The audio pickup captured every word with devastating clarity. This wasn't just bribery, it was systematic, organized, and priced according to a fee schedule that treated justice like a commodity, to be purchased by the highest bidder. The Peterson case comes before you next Tuesday, the visitor continued, his voice carrying the professional tone of someone conducting routine business. The family has significant assets, and they're very motivated to see this resolved quietly. No prison time, minimal probation, sealed records if possible. Harrison nodded as he continued counting. Peterson, that's the insurance executive's son, correct? The allegations involving the neighbor's daughter. His tone was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the systematic perversion of justice. That's the one. The evidence is problematic. DNA results, witness testimony, medical records. You'll need to be creative with your rulings. Creative is my specialty, Harrison replied with a chuckle that made Martinez's stomach turn. I've been handling these family protection cases for 3 years now. Trust me, I know exactly how to make evidence disappear. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Harrison and his visitor discussing specific legal strategies for undermining the prosecution's case. They talked about excluding evidence on fabricated technicalities, discrediting witnesses through procedural manipulation, and ensuring that any conviction would result in the minimum possible sentence. As the meeting concluded, Harrison carefully placed cash in a hidden compartment behind his law books, the money disappearing into what was clearly a well-established concealment system. "Same time next month for the Henderson case?" he asked as his visitor prepared to leave. "Absolutely. The Henderson family is even more motivated than Peterson. Their son is looking at federal charges if this goes badly. They're prepared to double the usual fee." The visitor departed through the same service entrance they had used to arrive, leaving Harrison alone in his chambers to count and organize his bribe money with the casual satisfaction of someone whose corruption had become routine. The hidden cameras captured every detail, every incriminating word, every piece of evidence that would eventually bring down one of the largest judicial corruption scandals in state history. Martinez sat in stunned silence as the surveillance feeds returned to showing empty corridors and darkened offices. In less than 20 minutes, they had captured enough evidence to destroy Harrison's career and send him to prison for decades. But more importantly, they had documented the systematic sale of justice to wealthy families who could afford to purchase favorable outcomes for their criminal children. The scope of what they had witnessed was staggering. This wasn't isolated corruption. It was an organized system that had been operating for years, with pricing structures, scheduling arrangements, and professional protocols that treated child abuse cases like business transactions. As Martinez reached for her phone to alert the rest of the team, she realized that what they had captured was just the beginning. If Harrison was running this kind of operation, he couldn't be working alone. There had to be others, attorneys, court officials, maybe even other judges, all participating in a conspiracy that had turned the courthouse into a marketplace where children's safety could be purchased by wealthy predators. The smoking gun they had been seeking was now documented in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. The question was no longer whether Harrison was corrupt. It was how deep the corruption went, and how many innocent victims had been sacrificed on the altar of greed. The surveillance of Harrison's movements following his bribe collection revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been refined through years of practice. Martinez and her team watched through carefully positioned cameras as the judge left the courthouse at 6:30 a.m. the following morning, his luxury sedan loaded with more than just his usual briefcase and judicial robes. Harrison's first stop was First National Bank, where he accessed a safe deposit box using a key that he retrieved from a hidden compartment in his vehicle's center console. The bank's security cameras, which Internal Affairs had obtained access to through federal banking regulations, captured him removing several thick manila envelopes from the box, replacing them with what appeared to be the previous night's cash payment. From there, Harrison drove to 3 different banks across the city, each visit lasting exactly 12 minutes, according to the surveillance team's timing logs. At each location, he made deposits to different accounts, the amounts carefully structured to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements for large cash transactions. His movements were precise, calculated, and spoke of someone who had developed a foolproof system for concealing illegal income. Detective Chang, monitoring from the financial surveillance van, watched the real-time banking data with growing amazement. He's depositing exactly $9,800 at each location, he reported over the encrypted radio channel. Just $200 below the federal reporting threshold. This guy knows exactly what he's doing. The pattern became even more sophisticated as Harrison visited 2 currency exchange businesses in the city's financial district. These establishments, which typically served legitimate international travelers and immigrant communities, were being used to convert large bills into smaller denominations and different currencies. Harrison emerged from each location with briefcases full of foreign currency, euros, Canadian dollars, British pounds, that would be virtually impossible to trace through conventional American banking systems. The final stop in Harrison's money laundering circuit was a private postal service in an upscale shopping center, where he mailed packages to addresses that the team's preliminary research suggested were shell companies in Caribbean tax havens. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. Harrison had created a financial pipeline that could move bribe money from his courthouse chambers to untraceable offshore accounts within 24 hours. Financial analysis back at the team's headquarters revealed the true scope of Harrison's corruption. Cross-referencing his banking activity with court calendar dates showed a pattern of deposits that corresponded perfectly with major case decisions. Every time Harrison ruled in favor of a wealthy defendant in a child abuse case, substantial cash deposits appeared in his accounts within days of the verdict. The offshore account discoveries were particularly damning. Through international banking cooperation agreements and federal financial intelligence networks, the team had identified at least 12 accounts in 6 different countries that appeared to be controlled by Harrison through various shell corporations and trust arrangements. The total amount of money flowing through these accounts exceeded $2.3 million over the past 3 years. "Look at this timeline," Detective Park said, spreading financial records across the country. Appears in the Bermuda account. The Westfield ruling was June 2nd, followed by a $70,000 deposit in the Cayman Islands account. The correlation was mathematically impossible to explain as coincidence. 17 major child abuse cases over 3 years, 17 controversial rulings that favored wealthy defendants, and 17 corresponding offshore deposits totaling over $2 million. Harrison hadn't just been taking occasional bribes. He had been operating a systematic corruption enterprise that treated justice like a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. The realization of scope hit the entire team simultaneously. This wasn't isolated judicial misconduct. It was organized crime operating within the justice system itself. The precision of the money laundering operation, the international banking arrangements, the sophisticated concealment methods, all of it suggested a network of criminal activity that extended far beyond one corrupt judge. "He's not working alone," Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of dawning understanding. "This level of financial sophistication requires professional help. Money laundering experts, international banking specialists, legal advisors. Harrison has a whole team helping him run this operation." The implications were staggering. If Harrison was part of a larger corruption network, how many other judges might be involved? How many prosecutors, defense attorneys, court officials, and administrative staff were participating in this systematic perversion of justice? The evidence they had gathered suggested a conspiracy that could reach into every level of the judicial system. Chang pulled up a financial analysis that showed irregular patterns in court scheduling and case assignments over the past 3 years. "Look at this. Certain types of high-profile child abuse cases involving wealthy defendants keep getting assigned to Harrison's courtroom. The odds of this happening randomly are essentially zero." The money trail had revealed more than just Harrison's personal corruption. It had exposed what appeared to be a comprehensive system for selling justice to wealthy families who could afford to purchase favorable outcomes for their criminal children. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined, and the evidence they were gathering suggested that children's safety had been systematically sacrificed for profit on a scale that defied comprehension. As the team prepared for the next phase of their investigation, Martinez felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. They were no longer just investigating one corrupt judge, they were uncovering what might be the largest judicial corruption scandal in American history. The weekend provided the perfect opportunity for the most dangerous phase of their investigation, a covert search of Harrison's private chambers when the courthouse was officially empty. Johnson and Max arrived at the building through the service entrance at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, their presence officially justified by a routine security sweep that had been cleared through channels that wouldn't appear in any permanent records. Max's behavior the moment they entered the judicial wing was unlike anything Johnson had witnessed in their 5-year partnership. The German Shepherd's agitation reached levels that suggested genuine distress, his sensitive nose working overtime as he processed scents that seemed to assault his carefully trained detection systems. His whining took on an urgent quality that spoke of desperate need to communicate something that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. "Easy, boy," Johnson whispered as they approached Harrison's chambers. "Show me what you've been trying to tell me." Max led them directly to Harrison's private office, his movements precise and purposeful despite his obvious agitation. Once inside, the dog immediately focused on a specific section of the wall behind Harrison's extensive law library, scratching at the base of a bookshelf with increasing desperation. Johnson examined the area that had captured Max's attention, running his hands along the wall surface and testing the stability of the bookshelf. His 20 years of police experience had taught him to recognize concealed compartments and hidden storage areas, and Max's persistent alerting suggested something significant was hidden behind what appeared to be a standard office fixture. The breakthrough came when Johnson noticed that several law books on the middle shelf were slightly out of alignment, as if they had been recently moved and carelessly replaced. When he pulled them aside, he discovered that they were, actually, hollow facades, concealing a sophisticated hidden panel in the wall behind them. The panel opened to reveal a hidden safe that made Johnson's breath catch in his throat. Inside were neat stacks of currency that represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, organized by denomination and bound with rubber bands. But the money was only the beginning of what Max had led them to discover. Detailed ledgers filled multiple notebooks, documenting bribes, cases, and payments with the precision of a professional accounting system. Each entry included case numbers, defendant names, payment amounts, and desired outcomes. The records went back over 4 years and included dozens of cases involving child abuse, domestic violence, and other crimes where wealthy defendants had purchased favorable treatment from the judicial system. Jesus Christ, Johnson whispered as he photographed page after page of incriminating evidence. Max, you've uncovered the entire operation. The documentation revealed a broader network that extended far beyond Harrison's individual corruption. Names of defense attorneys, court clerks, prosecutors, ledgers, all apparently participating in what amounted to a comprehensive conspiracy to sell justice to the highest bidder. One particular notebook contained what appeared to be a price list for different types of favorable rulings. Simple misdemeanor dismissals cost $25,000. Felony charge reductions required $50,000. Complete acquittals in serious cases demanded $100,000 or more. Child abuse cases involving wealthy defendants had their own pricing structure, with costs ranging from $75,000 for suspended sentences to $150,000 for complete case dismissals. The scope of the conspiracy became clear as Johnson continued photographing the evidence. This wasn't just judicial corruption. It was organized crime operating at the highest levels of the justice system. The ledgers documented hundreds of cases over multiple years, representing millions of dollars in bribe payments and countless victims denied justice. Martinez's voice crackled through Johnson's earpiece. "What's your status?" Max's alerting showed up on our monitoring equipment. "Martinez, you need to see this," Johnson replied, his voice tight with the magnitude of what they had discovered. "Max led us to a hidden safe. We've got ledgers, cash, records going back years. This is bigger than we ever imagined." The evidence suggested that children's safety had been systematically traded for money, with wealthy families purchasing favorable outcomes for family members accused of the most serious crimes. The human cost was incalculable. Dozens of child predators walking free, their victims denied justice, all because corruption had infected the very institutions meant to protect society's most vulnerable members. As Johnson completed his documentation of the hidden safe's contents, Max's agitation finally began to subside. The German shepherd had accomplished what he had been trying to communicate for months. He had led his human partners to the heart of a corruption conspiracy that had perverted justice on an unprecedented scale. The evidence they had gathered would ultimately bring down not just Harrison, but an entire network of corrupt officials who had turned the courthouse into a marketplace where children's safety could be purchased by wealthy predators. Max's instincts had been right all along, and his persistence had uncovered what would become the largest judicial corruption scandal in state history. The smoking gun they had been seeking was now documented in thousands of photographs, recorded conversations, and financial records that painted an undeniable picture of systematic corruption. The investigation was no longer about proving Harrison's guilt. It was about determining how many others were involved and how many innocent victims had been betrayed by the very system meant to protect them. The small apartment that Mia and her mother had moved to after the trial felt more like a shelter than a home. Every creak of the floorboards made 7-year-old Mia pause with concern, her small body tensing as difficult memories returned without warning. The nightmares that had begun during her traumatic experiences had intensified after seeing her stepfather leave the courthouse as a free man, his confident expression a constant presence in her dreams that no amount of colorful nightlights or stuffed animals could chase away. Sleep had become challenging for Mia. When exhaustion finally claimed her small body, her dreams transformed into scenarios where her stepfather's voice echoed through dark corridors, suggesting that he might return, that the judge's decision meant he could approach her again without consequences. She would wake crying, her sheets damp with perspiration, her mother rushing to comfort her with reassurances that felt increasingly fragile in the face of their shared worry. The concerning phone calls began 3 days after the verdict. The voice was always different, sometimes rough and intimidating, sometimes eerily calm, occasionally disguised through electronic distortion, but the message remained consistent. The girl should learn to stay quiet. Difficult situations happen to children who speak inappropriately. Mia's mother, Sarah, would disconnect immediately, but the calls continued at all hours. During breakfast, the phone would ring, and Mia would watch her mother's face grow pale as another threat filled their kitchen with invisible tension. Late at night, when they finally felt secure enough to rest, the shrill ring would startle them both awake, hearts racing with renewed anxiety. The discovery of the first concerning item on their doorstep came on a Tuesday morning, when Sarah was preparing to take Mia to her therapy appointment. A small object had been placed with deliberate precision, positioned so that it would be impossible to miss when they opened the front door. A note attached read, "Those who speak too much sometimes face consequences." The intimidation tactics escalated with methodical precision. Unwelcome items appeared in their mailbox. Garbage cans were overturned in the middle of the night, their contents scattered across the small lawn in patterns that seemed deliberately menacing. Windows were marked with substances that left streaks running down the glass, each impact causing Mia to flinch as if she were being physically approached. Sarah's concern manifested in increasingly comprehensive safety layer of tension to their already worried existence. Mia's regression was heartbreaking to witness. The little girl who had once been curious and outgoing retreated into herself like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Bedwetting resumed, her small body releasing the physical manifestations of trauma that her young mind couldn't process. Selective silence transformed her from a chatty child into someone who communicated primarily through nods, whispers, and the kind of expressive eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. The attachment behavior became constant and exhausting. Mia couldn't bear to be separated from her mother for even brief moments, her small hands gripping Sarah's clothing with desperate strength. Bathroom visits required accompaniment. Grocery shopping became impossible unless Mia was physically close to her mother's side. And even sleeping required Mia's bed to be moved into Sarah's room, where she could maintain visual contact throughout the night. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Mia's child psychologist, worked with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. Their therapy sessions took place in a carefully designed room filled with toys, art supplies, and comfortable furniture that was meant to feel more like a playroom than a medical facility. Dr. Martinez had specialized in childhood trauma for over 15 years, and she recognized in Mia the signs of a child whose trust in the world had been fundamentally challenged. "Mia, can you tell me about the worried feelings?" Dr. Martinez would ask gently, her voice carrying the kind of professional warmth that had helped hundreds of traumatized children find their way back to emotional safety. The question would hang in the air like a gentle invitation, never demanding an immediate response, but always offering a doorway through which Mia could choose to walk when she felt ready. Dr. Martinez had learned through years of specialized training that the timing of therapeutic breakthroughs couldn't be forced or predicted. They emerged organically when a child's internal sense of safety aligned with their need to be understood. Mia's initial responses were often nonverbal. She might point to her stomach and make a face that suggested discomfort, or she might wrap her arms around herself in a protective gesture that spoke volumes about her internal emotional state. Sometimes she would simply shake her head, indicating that the worried feelings were too big or too scary. Breathe, like when you run really fast and can't catch your breath. Dr. Martinez documented these descriptions with careful attention to both content and context, understanding that Mia's ability to identify and locate her emotional responses represented significant progress in developing emotional awareness and regulation skills. The somatic approach to trauma therapy recognized that children often experienced emotional distress as physical sensations before they developed the cognitive capacity to understand and articulate their feelings. Where do the worried feelings live right now as we're talking about them? Dr. Martinez asked, her tone remaining consistently gentle and curious rather than clinical or demanding. Mia closed her eyes and placed both hands on her chest, her small face scrunching with concentration as she performed what amounted to an internal body scan. "Right here," she said, patting the area over her heart. "They feel like a bird trying to get out of a cage, flapping its wings really fast but not going anywhere." This metaphor revealed the sophisticated way that Mia's young mind was attempting to process complex emotional states. The image of a caged bird suggested not just anxiety, but a desire for freedom, movement, and escape from confinement, themes that were central to her recovery process and her growing understanding of her own emotional needs. Progress came in increments so small they were almost invisible. Mia began drawing pictures that expressed emotions she couldn't verbalize, dark scribbles that represented her stepfather, bright colors that showed her mother's love, and gradually, tiny figures that began to resemble a little girl who might someday feel secure again. Play therapy sessions allowed her to act out scenarios with dolls, giving voice to experiences that were too difficult to discuss directly. The evolution of Mia's artwork provided a visual timeline of her healing journey that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Her earliest drawings consisted almost entirely of black and dark purple scribbles that covered entire sheets of paper, with chaotic, aggressive strokes that seemed to express rage, fear, and confusion that couldn't be contained within normal boundaries. "This is how the inside of my head feels," she explained during one early session, holding up a drawing that looked like a storm rendered in crayon. "Everything is mixed up and loud and scary, and I can't make it stop or make it quiet." Dr. Martinez carefully preserved each drawing, understanding the artwork. Small spots of yellow began to emerge within the dark scribbles, tiny points of light that suggested hope, warmth, or positive emotions finding space within the overwhelming darkness. These yellow spots were often accompanied by verbal explanations that revealed Mia's growing ability to identify and name positive experiences, even within the context of ongoing trauma recovery. "The yellow is mommy hugging me when I have bad dreams," Mia explained, pointing to a particularly bright spot within an otherwise dark composition. "It doesn't make the scary colors go away, but it makes them not the only colors anymore." This observation demonstrated remarkable emotional sophistication for a 7-year-old, revealing that Mia was developing an understanding of emotional complexity that would serve her well throughout her recovery process. She was learning that healing didn't require the complete absence of difficult emotions, but rather the presence of sufficient positive experiences to create balance and hope. The introduction of human figures into Mia's artwork marked another significant milestone in her therapeutic progress. Initially, these figures were basic stick drawings with exaggerated features that emphasized emotional states rather than realistic representation. The scary man figure appeared consistently as a large, dark shape with sharp angles and aggressive posturing, while the mommy figure was depicted with soft curves, bright colors, and protective gestures. The scary man has pointy edges because he says things that poke and hurt, Mia explained, showing Dr. Martinez a drawing that depicted the contrast between these two figures with remarkable clarity. Mommy has round edges because her hugs feel soft and safe, and when she talks to me, her words feel like warm blankets. These artistic expressions allowed Mia to explore and process complex relationship dynamics without having to engage in direct verbal discussion of traumatic experiences. The symbolic representation provided emotional distance that made difficult topics more manageable while still allowing for meaningful therapeutic work to occur. Dr. Martinez introduced guided imagery exercises that helped Mia develop mental tools for managing overwhelming emotions when they arose. These exercises were presented as games or stories rather than clinical interventions, making them accessible and engaging for a young child, while still providing substantive therapeutic benefit. Let's imagine that you have a magic remote control for your feelings anymore. They would just be talking in regular voices that I could choose to listen to or not listen to. This visualization became one of Mia's most frequently used coping strategies, something she could access independently when Dr. Martinez wasn't available to provide support. The concept of emotional volume control gave her a sense of agency over internal experiences that had previously felt completely beyond her influence. The dollhouse that occupied one corner of Dr. Martinez's office became a crucial therapeutic tool that allowed Mia to explore family dynamics, safety concerns, and relationship patterns through displaced play rather than direct discussion. The small figures could be manipulated to act out scenarios that would be too overwhelming to discuss in first person, while still allowing Mia to process complex emotional material. "The little girl doll is scared to go to sleep," Mia narrated during one particularly significant play therapy session, moving the small figure around the dollhouse bedroom with careful attention to detail. "She keeps checking under the bed and behind the door, because sometimes bad things happen when it gets dark and quiet." Dr. Martinez observed these play scenarios with trained attention to symbolic content, relationship patterns, and emotional themes that emerged through Mia's manipulation of the dolls and dollhouse environment. The displaced nature of the play allowed Mia to explore traumatic material while maintaining psychological safety through the fantasy barrier that separated her real experiences from the doll family's adventures. "What helps the little girl doll feel safer when she's scared?" Dr. Martinez asked, introducing the possibility of problem-solving and coping strategies through the therapeutic play framework. Mia considered this question carefully, moving the mother doll closer to the child figure and arranging the furniture to create what appeared to be a more protective environment. "The mommy doll stays close by and leaves the hall light on so it's not completely dark," she replied. "And the little girl doll has a special stuffed animal that knows how to scare away bad dreams." These play therapy solutions often translated directly into real-world coping strategies that Mia could implement in her own bedroom and daily routines. The therapeutic play provided a safe laboratory for experimenting with different approaches to managing fear and anxiety, while the symbolic distance made it possible to explore solutions without feeling overwhelmed by direct confrontation with traumatic happened to her. Mia narrated during one session, holding a small doll and speaking in a voice that carried both vulnerability and determination. Some grown-ups didn't believe her at first, but she kept telling the truth because she knew it was important. Finally, some very good grown-ups listened to her and helped make sure the scary thing wouldn't happen to other little girls. Dr. Martinez recognized this narrative as evidence of Mia's growing sense of empowerment and her developing understanding of her own role in a larger story about justice, protection, and advocacy. The evolution from victim to survivor to potential advocate was occurring through play therapy in ways that direct discussion might not have achieved. The introduction of art therapy techniques that combined drawing with storytelling provided another avenue for Mia to explore and express complex emotional material. She began creating illustrated stories that featured brave child protagonists overcoming various challenges with the help of supportive adults and their own inner strength. One particularly significant story featured a little girl who discovered that her voice had magical properties. When she spoke truth, flowers bloomed around her, and when she sang, birds came to listen and carry her messages to other children who needed to hear them. The protagonist in this story faced obstacles and scary characters, but she never lost her magical voice because she understood how important it was for helping other children feel less alone. The Magic Voice Girl knows that telling the truth can be scary, Mia explained, showing Dr. Martinez detailed illustrations that depicted various scenes from her story. But she also knows that staying quiet when bad things happen makes the magic weaker. So she practices using her voice every day, even when it's hard, because that's how the magic stays strong. This story represented a profound shift in Mia's self-concept from victim to empowered individual with agency and purpose. The magical voice metaphor allowed her to explore themes of personal power, social responsibility, and the importance of truth-telling without becoming overwhelmed by the real-world implications of these concepts. Dr. Martinez began introducing mindfulness techniques adapted for children, teaching Mia simple meditation and breathing exercises that could help regulate her nervous system during moments of acute anxiety or trauma activation. These techniques were presented as games and adventures rather than formal practices, making them accessible and engaging for a young child. She felt overwhelmed or anxious. The somatic regulation techniques helped her develop internal resources for managing difficult emotions independently, reducing her reliance on external sources of comfort and increasing her sense of personal competency. The therapeutic relationship itself became a crucial component of Mia's healing process. Dr. Martinez's consistent presence, unconditional positive regard, and professional expertise provided Mia with a corrective emotional experience that began to repair her fundamental trust in adult caregivers. The therapy room became a reliable, safe space where Mia could experiment with vulnerability, practice emotional expression, and receive validation and support without judgment or consequences. "Dr. Martinez always believes me," Mia told her mother during a car ride home from one session. "Even when I tell her about the really scary stuff, she doesn't get upset or tell me I'm wrong. She just listens and helps me figure out what to do with the feelings." This observation highlighted the importance of therapeutic consistency and professional boundaries in trauma recovery work with children. Dr. Martinez's ability to remain emotionally regulated while witnessing Mia's pain provided a model of adult stability that contrasted sharply with the chaos and unpredictability that had characterized Mia's experiences with other authority figures. As their therapeutic work progressed through months of consistent sessions, Mia began to demonstrate increased emotional regulation, improved sleep patterns, reduced anxiety symptoms, and growing confidence in her ability to communicate her needs and feelings to trusted adults. The progress was gradual and sometimes interrupted by setbacks, but the overall trajectory showed clear movement toward healing and integration. The transformation was becoming visible not just in therapeutic sessions, but in Mia's daily life, where she began to engage more actively with age-appropriate activities, show interest in friendships with other children, and demonstrate the kind of natural curiosity and joy that trauma had temporarily suppressed. Her journey from silence to voice, from victim to survivor, was unfolding through the careful, patient work of therapeutic healing that honored both her pain and her remarkable resilience. The breakthrough moments were precious and fragile. Mia would whisper a few words about her experiences, then immediately retreat into silence, as if the effort had exhausted her emotional reserves, never pausing in their careful placement of a tiny dining room table. "He said it was our special secret, but secrets aren't supposed to make you feel scared and sad inside." Dr. Martinez had learned to recognize the signs that preceded these moments of vulnerability. Mia would grow very still, her breathing would become shallow, and her eyes would take on a distant quality, as if she were seeing something far beyond the cheerful walls of the therapy room. These were the moments when the barriers between conscious thought and buried trauma grew thin enough for truth to emerge. "What did scared and sad feel like in your body, Mia?" Dr. Martinez would ask gently, using the somatic therapy techniques that help children connect emotional experiences to physical sensations. This approach allowed young minds to process trauma without becoming overwhelmed by abstract concepts they weren't developmentally ready to understand. "Like butterflies in my stomach, but not good butterflies," Mia explained during one particularly breakthrough session. "Like angry butterflies that wanted to fly away but couldn't find the window. And my throat felt tight, like when you want to cry but the tears get stuck halfway up." These descriptions revealed the sophisticated way that Mia's young mind had attempted to process experiences that no child should ever have to endure. Dr. Martinez carefully documented not just the content of these revelations, but the physical responses, the emotional contexts, and the environmental factors that seemed to facilitate Mia's ability to share her experiences. The art therapy component of their sessions proved especially valuable in helping Mia express emotions that existed beyond the boundaries of her 7-year-old vocabulary. Her drawings evolved from chaotic scribbles of black and red to more structured images that told stories without words. One particularly significant piece showed a small figure standing behind a large window, hands pressed against the glass, while dark shapes moved on the other side. "The little girl is safe behind the window," Mia explained, pointing to the figure with careful precision. "The scary things can't get through the glass, but she can still see them trying. Sometimes she wishes the window wasn't there so she could run away, but sometimes she's glad it's there because running away might not work." Dr. Martinez recognized this drawing as a profound metaphor for Mia's psychological state. The window represented the protective barriers her mind had constructed around the traumatic memories, barriers that kept her safe but also kept her isolated from full emotional engagement with the world around her. As weeks passed, the therapy sessions became Mia's only refuge from the fear that dogged. But outside that sanctuary, the intimidation continued, reminding them daily that speaking truth came with consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. The intimidation tactics had evolved beyond simple threatening phone calls and disturbing items left on their doorstep. Sarah began noticing cars that seemed to follow her during errands, vehicles that would maintain a careful distance but appear too frequently to be coincidental. The drivers were always different, sometimes a woman in sunglasses, sometimes a man in a baseball cap, occasionally teenagers who looked too young to be involved in such sophisticated harassment. These mobile surveillance efforts created a sense of paranoia that extended beyond rational concern into the realm of constant hypervigilance. Sarah found herself checking mirrors obsessively, varying her routes to ordinary destinations, and timing her departures from home to avoid predictable patterns that might make surveillance easier. The psychological impact on Mia was immediate and devastating. The little girl who had already been struggling with basic feelings of safety now lived in a world where even leaving their apartment required strategic planning and anxiety management. Car rides became exercises in fear, with Mia constantly checking the rear window and asking questions that no 7-year-old should have to ask. "Mommy, is that car following us? Are the bad people trying to find where we live?" Sarah's attempts to maintain normalcy in the face of this harassment required creativity and emotional strength that she sometimes felt she didn't possess. Simple activities like grocery shopping became elaborate operations that required scouting locations, identifying exit routes, and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. The mental exhaustion of living in this heightened state of alert began to take its toll on both mother and daughter. "I'm tired of being scared all the time," Mia confided to Dr. Martinez during one session, her small voice carrying a weariness that seemed impossibly mature. "I dream about being a regular little girl who doesn't have to check behind doors before she walks into rooms. Do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" These questions broke Dr. Martinez's heart, but they also represented significant progress in Mia's emotional development. The ability to articulate her current emotional state and envision a different future suggested that her capacity for hope hadn't been entirely destroyed by trauma and ongoing intimidation. Normal might look different for you independently. Deep breathing exercises became games where Mia imagined inflating balloons in her chest. Progressive muscle relaxation transformed into activities where she pretended to be different animals, tensing and releasing muscle groups while roaring like lions or stretching like cats. Visualization techniques helped Mia create mental safe spaces that she could access during moments of overwhelming anxiety. Together, she and Dr. Martinez constructed an elaborate imaginary treehouse, complete with rope ladders that could be pulled up when privacy was needed, windows that looked out over peaceful meadows, and a special door that only opened for people who made Mia feel safe and protected. When the scared feelings get too big, Dr. Martinez explained, you can close your eyes and climb up to your treehouse. You can stay there as long as you need to, and nobody can bother you there unless you decide to let them in. This visualization became one of Mia's most valuable tools, something she could access during therapy sessions, at home during difficult moments, and even at school when unexpected triggers caused anxiety to spike without warning. The treehouse became a portable sanctuary that existed entirely within her own mind, immune to external threats and always available when needed. Meanwhile, the investigation that would ultimately provide justice for Mia and hundreds of other children was beginning to take shape in ways that nobody could have predicted. Officer Johnson's initial suspicions about Judge Harrison, triggered by his partner Max's unusual behavior during a routine courthouse visit, had evolved into a comprehensive investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies and specialized units trained in public corruption cases. Max, the German shepherd whose sensitive nose had first detected the scent of corruption, continued to play a crucial role in the expanding investigation. His ability to identify locations where large amounts of cash had been stored or exchanged provided investigators with probable cause for searches that revealed increasingly damning evidence of systematic judicial misconduct. The bond between Officer Johnson and Max had deepened throughout the investigation, their partnership evolving beyond typical canine handler relationships into something that approached telepathic communication. Johnson had learned to read Max's subtle behavioral cues with extraordinary precision, understanding when the dog's alertness indicated the presence of evidence and when his relaxed demeanor realized at the time. As the investigation expanded, Max's alerts consistently identified locations and individuals connected to the corruption network, even when those connections weren't immediately obvious to human investigators. His success rate approached 100%, a statistical anomaly that suggested abilities beyond conventional scent detection. The psychological profile that investigators developed of Judge Harrison revealed a man whose corruption had evolved gradually over many years, beginning with small compromises and escalating into systematic criminal enterprise. Financial records showed a lifestyle that far exceeded his judicial salary, funded through a sophisticated network of bribes, case fixing, and influence peddling that had generated millions of dollars over nearly a decade. Harrison's personal history included gambling debts, failed business investments, and expensive habits that had created financial pressures, making him vulnerable to corruption. His progression from occasional small bribes to systematic case manipulation followed predictable patterns that law enforcement experts recognized from other public corruption investigations. But Harrison wasn't operating alone. The investigation revealed a network of complicit officials, defense attorneys, and court personnel who had created an entire ecosystem of corruption that perverted every aspect of the judicial process. Case assignments were manipulated to ensure that wealthy defendants faced judges who could be purchased. Evidence was suppressed, witnesses were intimidated, and verdicts were predetermined based on the amount of money changing hands, rather than facts presented in court. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond individual corruption into systematic manipulation of the child protection infrastructure that was supposed to safeguard society's most vulnerable members. Social services investigations had been compromised, evidence collection had been sabotaged, witness testimonies had been discredited, and judicial proceedings had been perverted, all in service of a criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits by selling justice to the highest bidder. Dr. Martinez began to understand that Mia's case represented just one example of systematic corruption that had denied justice to hundreds of children over many years. The failed prosecution of Mia's stepfather wasn't an isolated incident of prosecutorial incompetence or judicial error. It was the predictable result of a system that had been deliberately corrupted to protect wealthy predators from accountability for their crimes. This realization transformed Dr. Martinez's therapeutic approach with Mia, not because the children did anything wrong, but because some adults in positions of authority make very bad choices. Dr. Martinez explained during one crucial session. When that happens, it's not just about one child or one family. It's about protecting all children from adults who abuse their power. This conversation marked a turning point in Mia's therapeutic journey. For the first time since her original disclosure of abuse, she began to understand that her experiences weren't unique, that other children had faced similar betrayals, and that her willingness to continue speaking truth could potentially protect other young victims from experiencing similar trauma. "Are there other little girls like me?" Mia asked, her voice carrying a mixture of sadness and dawning purpose. "Other little girls who told the truth but nobody believed them?" "Yes," Dr. Martinez replied honestly, "and that's why your courage in continuing to tell your story is so important. When children like you refuse to be silenced, it helps protect other children who might not yet have found their own voices." The little girl who had once held tea parties for her stuffed animals was learning that the adult world was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. But she was also beginning to understand that remaining silent in the face of wrongdoing was its own form of defeat. Her transformation from victim to survivor to potential advocate was beginning, guided by professional support and family love, but ultimately driven by her own recognition that truth-telling could be a form of protection for other vulnerable children. As spring arrived, bringing longer days and warmer weather, Mia began to show signs of emotional healing that extended beyond the therapy room into her daily life. The nightmares that had once terrorized her sleep began to occur less frequently, replaced by dreams that sometimes included images of safety, protection, and even occasional moments of childhood joy. Her artwork evolved from dark scribbles representing fear and trauma to more complex compositions that included figures representing help, hope, and healing. One particularly significant piece showed a small girl standing on a stage, speaking into a microphone, while an audience of other children listened with expressions of understanding and support. "This is me telling my story so other children know they're not alone," Mia explained, pointing to the figure on the stage with obvious pride. "And these are all the children who need to know that telling the truth control." The investigation that would ultimately provide justice for Mia and countless other children continued to expand, with Max's contributions proving increasingly valuable as evidence mounted against the corruption network. Officer Johnson documented every alert, every successful identification of evidence, and every instance where Max's instincts led to breakthrough discoveries that human investigators might have missed. As summer approached, bringing with it the promise of justice delayed but not denied, both Mia and the investigation were approaching crucial turning points that would determine whether truth and accountability could triumph over corruption and systematic abuse of power. The little girl who had once been silenced by a corrupt system was finding her voice, while the German shepherd whose instincts had detected the scent of corruption was helping to build a case that would ultimately restore faith in justice for an entire community. The convergence of these two stories, a child's journey toward healing and an investigation's movement toward accountability, would soon create opportunities for both personal closure and systematic reform that could protect future generations of children from experiencing similar betrayals of trust. The pivotal therapy session that would change everything began like dozens of others, with Mia sitting cross-legged on the floor of Dr. Martinez's office, carefully arranging toy figures in patterns that represented the complex emotions she couldn't yet articulate. But today, Dr. Martinez had prepared something different, a conversation that would challenge Mia to see beyond her own trauma and understand the broader implications of her silence. "Mia," Dr. Martinez said gently, settling onto the floor beside her young patient, "I want to talk to you about something important. Do you remember what we discussed about other children who might be going through scary things like you did?"